Hi there. Good afternoon. My name is Sakib Haq. I'm from the International Center for Climate Change and Development based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So good afternoon from here in Bangladesh, but also maybe morning and evening for a lot of our virtual this audience that are joining us on the live stream. So thank you for joining us for the virtual summit on the regional resilience hubs. For those of you that might know, the Resilience Hub is a physical pavilion that started off in COP26 with the Global Resilience Partnership in collaboration with a number of collaborating organizations that hosted to look at the issues of resilience that need to be addressed at the international negotiations and what are some of the local approaches that need to be brought to the forefront. And from that initiative, because it was physically hosted into the pavilions where quite a lot of local organizations and initiatives don't often make it into the conventions, into the international negotiations and the forums. What we envisioned with a number of our partner organizations, such as my center here in Dhaka, Bangladesh, is to be able to do the regional resilience hubs, looking at the regional activities, what are local actors working on, what are some of the local expertise that we need to be bringing in into the international forum, but also to learn from ourselves. What are some of the activities that we're all working on that can really inspire changes and bring in impacts into the locally led adaptation issues that we've been focusing on, bringing in resilience from communities, bringing in impacts that can be able to alleviate some of the challenges that communities are facing. So I'm very, very delighted to have an esteemed panel with us here today. Many of the expertise on this call alone spans decades that we really need to be tapping into. And what are some of the ways that we can be bringing in these best practices, these knowledges that we've been working with our communities in our own respective backgrounds, but how can we cross-fertilize? How do we make sure that this is something that goes across regions, across communities, across districts? And we hope that this summit is a start for us to be able to do that. We've been doing the regional hubs over the last 4 years now, where we have a number of organizations that have been consistently following, not just in being able to talk about the projects and initiatives that they're engaged in, but also in the activities that their partners are working on, bringing in their local community as the voices that we can listen from directly, people that have that experience that they're living through, not just as practitioners as we are working on the issues, but also people that are living in those contexts, being very, very relevant to the impacts that they're facing. It's extremely important for us in particular to make sure that they are the voices that are represented, no matter how we synthesize and bring these issues back up to the global level. There needs to be an element that we're focusing on the communities, on the localities, and how do we bring that forward here directly for them. So we're very delighted for all our partners to have arranged for this virtual summit over the last 2 days. For many of you that have been following a lot of the sessions that have happened previously all through yesterday, we had a number of our locally led adaptation initiatives that have been highlighted. Today, I'd like to draw on to our panel. I'll give a brief introduction and ask them to come onto the mic at their behest. So we have Mr. Ajay Dixit, who's a experienced water professional working on South Asia regional water challenges. We have Ms. Suruchi Bharadwal, who's the climate change specialist from TERI, who's been working on a number of local challenges and issues that we would like to hear our experiences about. We have Dr. Hamid Jamil, who's also an experienced resilience and disaster management expert who's been working on these issues in regional and local levels for a number of years. And we have our esteemed colleague of ours from the BRAC Climate Bridge Fund, the head of the Climate Bridge Fund, Dr. Ghulam Rabbani. We also have, as my colleague, a technical director from IID and a long-time negotiator for the Nepalese government, Dr. Bimal Rejmi. So what I would like to do now for our speakers and our panelists is talk a little bit about some of the issues that we've been trying to highlight from the regional levels and identify what were some of the good practices that we really need to be bringing into the international forum, and what have been some of the limiting elements that have really stopped us from being able to bring impactful evidences from the ground to the international level and vice versa. What are some of the support and challenges coming from the international areas that are not really filtering down to the local levels? So with that being said, I understand a number of our speakers do have other commitments and they might need to make a run out of the session, but I would really like to hear from them. So if Dr. Hamid, if you don't mind, perhaps I could ask you to start with your remarks. And I believe that starts off with a good note, because we'll be talking about some of the best practices. So I think it's always good for us to start a session on a positive note. So please, Dr. Hamid, the floor is yours. After your remarks, if you could please hand back to me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think this is one of the opportunities where we can share some of the best practices across the South Asian region. My talk is basically based on one of the assessments that we did, and Dr. Bimal was part of that. So we assessed some of the regional projects, some of the country-based projects on adaptation across South Asia, covering 6 countries, and we identified some of the good practices that I will talk about. That are some of the common factors that have been common in delivering the successful outcomes of these adaptation measures. Some of them were not so good, but I'll focus on the positives as I've been told. So, for example, there are of course country contexts. There are of course different political, cultural, and economic scenarios across South Asian countries. But what we have focused here is some of the lessons learned that can be incorporated or that were successfully implemented across South Asia. So these are some of the common lessons that we can bank on for future adaptation planning. So, for example, one of the key aspects that we saw is that was successfully implemented, or was the common factor, was how to factor risk and vulnerability into selection of areas and communities or households. For example, this was one of the key successes of different projects. For example, an NCCSP project in Nepal. I'll start with that. So it used hazard maps, vulnerability, and risk assessments to help identify some of the vulnerable hotspots and potential adaptation options, including categorizing households in different categories. For example, they were categorized in 4 vulnerability categories: the most vulnerable, highly vulnerable, medium vulnerable, and low vulnerability. So actually pinning down vulnerability at the very local level. So categorizing households and areas in terms of how vulnerable they are. For example, starting with the vulnerability and risk assessments were carried out to identify the vulnerable geographical hotspots. Detailed households were surveys were conducted in each of the program areas to understand the differentiated risk and vulnerability of households. So then these households were then categorized into these 4 categories. So I think factoring risk and vulnerability into selection of areas is one of the key lessons that we should be incorporating while designing adaptation programs. I mean, of course, the contextual um, conditions or factors can differ, but I think once we start knowing who is vulnerable, where is vulnerable, to what is one of the key starting points that's going to help in designing adaptation programs that can result in successful results. Uh, One of the second lessons that we saw was that sometimes the rigid, adaptation programming and program design are quite counterproductive. So it has to be flexible and adaptive. The project design should be adaptive and flexible. Why? Because we now see that in South Asian regions, political situations can change quickly, climate scenarios can change quickly, climate impacts can change very dramatically. It can affect a lot of things on the ground. So flexible and adaptive program design is very important because it ensures, for example, co-creation of your project design and different elements with the help of the government. What are the priorities? What are the policy priorities and program priorities? It also, strengthens government capacity and system. For example, if it is not so much of flexible and adaptive, and it's sticking to one of the theory of change or one of its core objectives, with the change of the government, with the change of the government system, the programs can stuck and they cannot go forward. So it can also, help government in integrating climate change into policies, plans, and public financial management, and also accessing some finances and climate resilient investments. For example, one of the interventions was PIF, a policy and institutions facility in Nepal. So it was a long-term TA support. It for 5 to 6 years. It was not a small intervention. It had a very flexible support. Interventions were demand driven. For example, the governments came up with some of the demands that they have, and then the programs were changed accordingly. There was risk-taking approach and learning from failures. So it was an iterative process. And it was co-creative process with the government. So this second part is also very important. How much time do I have? I heard a click or something. Um, Then the third lesson that we can learn from this assessment or the review of these programs that we saw was a joint up approach to climate planning, finance, and climate information services. For example, it has to align with countries' visions, priorities, and policy programs that are ongoing. It has to strengthen the existing national capacities so that the funding can be accessed and distributed at the local level. And also it has to contribute to developing countries' systems and increase government ownership. So joined up approach is one of the really key factors that we saw was one of the common factors of successful adaptation programs. For example, one of the post-conflict project in Sri Lanka, it was led by Ministry of Disaster Management and supported by several related ministries. So disaster management ministry was given the key role, and the other actors came together that were involved: NGOs, CPOs, private sector actors, all the local people and the communities. So that was one of the reasons it got really successful. And for example, the intervention included development of institutional capacities to assess risk, designing appropriate interventions, and implementing adaptation and action at the local level. So it resulted in the ownership of the government and local institutions as well. So that was one of the third key lessons that we learned from these programs. And one of the key lessons that was very important was decentralization funding and its strengthening local institutions. We know adaptation has to happen at the local level. So while the policy level and strategic level programming can be done at the central level, provincial level, but the adaptation has ultimately is a local level adaptation because people are vulnerable at the very local level. So setting up local climate adaptation funds at local levels under their, so that they can have the authorities to and the responsibility as well, with transparent fiduciary mechanisms and high levels of accountability, of course, to the local communities. So these are some of the things that we saw, that decentralization of funding and strengthening local stream was really key to successful adaptation programs. For example, one of the Logic project in Bangladesh. And then second part of this is simplified process to the facility. Local level adaptation involves shorter startup time from approval to disbursement of funds. It has to be very efficient. It does not have to go to the bureaucratic processes of 2-3 layers, so that because sometimes adaptation has to happen quickly. So that was one of the key lessons. Logic government, for example, Logic project in Bangladesh did apply this model, and it disbursed more than around 10 million US dollars as CRF grants. So this was one of the lessons that was very important in terms of advancing the local level adaptation. And then some of the transformative adaptation technologies, practices, they are very effective to address sectoral level risks and vulnerabilities, because we know there are certain technologies which are which can which can include adaptation of practices at large scale that are truly innovative, flexible, and contextualized. Contextualization is very important, because some technologies can be very effective at the larger scale in different countries, but bringing them at the local level through the help of local communities and local adaptation committees is very important. For example, in agriculture, we saw that climate smart agriculture, innovative climate financing mechanism, they help farmers to adapt. And one of the key elements was the access to climate information. That was very important, that how farmers, how local level people can have access to climate information that they can use to plan their farming, maximize their yields, and cope with climate variability and different shocks. For example, also in water, we saw that integrated water resource management models were very important. And community-based flood and early warning system are one of the key elements we saw in many countries, including in Pakistan, Nepal, and other areas, that community-based early warning system, by involving local communities, provides local level information that is translated into local level, but also is accessible when it's needed. So these are some of the areas I can go on, but I don't know how much time do I have, but I'll do my last point and then I'll stop there. And then green, resilient, and inclusive approaches, they address multifaceted nature of poverty and vulnerability. So we know that climate is a cross-cutting theme, and it cannot be addressed through one type of projects or one type of interventions. For example, these practices look beyond business as usual technologies and propose solutions that are anticipatory in nature, green, resilient, and inclusive. Inclusive part is very, very important here. They can be green, but if they are not inclusive, they are not targeting the right people and right vulnerable groups and locations and geographical areas. So, for example, one of the new project in Nepal was under their greening city agenda. They provided technical support to engage with Nepal Infrastructure Development Bank and Town Development Fund to promote infrastructure development and through public-private partnership projects. They leveraged more than 60 million pounds to grid-aligned projects for renewal of heritage sites, modern slaughterhouse, cycle tracks for tourism. So this was a multifaceted project. So it's very important that these interventions are done through multifaceted approach, because climate change impacts different groups differently and different sectors differently. So standalone projects usually are not successful. Small time duration projects are not successful. So it's really important that it need to be multifaceted approach to address the climate impacts on different communities. That was some of the successful interventions that we saw, successful project that we saw in across South Asia, and these were some of the key areas that could be applied to design adaptation projects, future projects in different countries. So I'll stop here. I think I have used my all time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hamid. So sorry for not getting into the breadth of some of the good practices and successful stories that you were allowed to allude. But I would recommend, as I've done for many of the virtual hub sessions, as well as a lot of our regional hub sessions, for many people that are following this session online, please do join us and look for our links on the events page where the speakers' bios and their contact details are listed. Also, a lot of their remarks and the projects that they will be mentioning and discussing about. So please do feel free to reach out with them if you have further questions and if you would like to learn more about these issues. We're a research center that relies heavily on people asking questions. So we try to provide all the links and the contact details so people might be able to be better informed. So just before I move on to the next speaker, I think some of the critical points that you highlighted are some of the elements that have really led for us to develop what we call the principles of locally led adaptation. In particular, sir, as you mentioned, the necessity for adaptation projects not to be siloed, to understand that adaptation doesn't happen in a vacuum just by itself, but the fact that this requires you to be working across different sectors. What we traditionally say is that climate change is going to be the sustainable development goal that impacts all the other goals. So really only looking at it from an environment lens and from a climate lens makes it very, very difficult to get the impactful benefits that we're really trying to strive in getting out of the initiatives that we set up. And secondly, the points that you put in together of flexibility and fast financing, not having drawn out processes and bureaucratic channels for particular adaptation, resilience, and now soon to be addressing loss and damage issues where time is really, really critical. We need to be a little bit more mindful about how these fundings are coming through, how quickly we're able to disperse them to the affected community, so we're really able to get the impacts that we're looking for in terms of the benefits from these funded projects, but also being flexible about that, not really being rigid into the proposal and the budget timelines that we had before. So I think those are some really, really good elements that you highlighted on that. Thank you so much, sir. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Mr. Ajay Dixit, who will talk a little bit about the regional issues that we've been having, particularly transboundary issues in managing adaptation and resilience projects. Mr. Ajay, after your remarks, if you could please hand back to me, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Sadiq. Thank you very much, Ikard, and thank you for this opportunity. Last week of September, Nepal had a massive disaster, and then this disaster hit southern part of Nepal, including Kathmandu. And Kathmandu faced highest average rainfall in 2 days recorded in the city over the last, 50, 60 years. And what we saw has exposed, some of the limitations and challenges that we've been talking about for the last so many years. I have been given two questions. First was to look at the challenges and opportunities. I really thank Dr. Hamid for highlighting some of the opportunities. I'm going to focus on challenges, and then of course these are the challenges that we've been talking about for the last so many years, and yet I think it's useful to kind of begin to reiterate those points, and then to see why we need to come together regionally, all these different countries, and then to take this process forward in tackling these challenges, at scale, whether you talk about adaptation, about resilience building, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do is to just briefly set the context of South Asia as a climate stress, climate threatened region. I'm going to highlight four challenges: one with food and water, other with health, other with climate induced migration, and then with infrastructure. And at the end, I'm going to talk about how I think this resilience building effort at a regional level could be pursued. Again, without further delay, again, South Asia is a climate threatened region. We've been all talking about it for a long time, and of course, it's now a living reality. It's not something that will happen in the future. And then, of course, it's a very diverse region, from the Himalayas to the valleys, to the hills, to the plains, to the coastal areas, to the deltas. We're talking about everything that you can find globally, except perhaps the dry desert of Rajasthan. Of course, I'm talking about the eastern region. Each region and people living in this region are highly sort of susceptible to emerging climate uncertainty, climate variability and risk, high increasing temperature and humidity, erratic monsoon, frequent landslide and floods that threaten agricultural system, infrastructure, human livelihoods, and overall development. Again, monsoon and westerlies are the two lifeblood of South Asia. They're depends on agriculture and our whole economy. The changes in onset, duration, and intensity of monsoon and shift in the rainfall pattern are again cause for floods and droughts within the same year. In Nepal and hills of India, flash floods and landslides during heavy monsoon have devastated communities, while in Bangladesh, we see increasing risk of cyclone and displacement, particularly, and storm surges in the coastal areas. And of course, rising sea level continues to become a serious threat to coastal areas, including that in Bangladesh. The Himalayan snow systems already depleting, the storage of fresh water, which threatens millions of people, their livelihood and well-being across the spectrum, from the Himalayas as well as all to the Delta. So this is kind of a very broad setting of the climate region. Now, what are the challenges? The first is food and water challenges. You see, it threatens stability of water as well as stability of food production. Even a small increase in temperature is already shown by scientists that the growing season can result in significant yield losses of rice and wheat, which is the major staple crop. It can also lead to rise in food prices and make it harder, particularly for the poorer segments of society, to afford basic nutrition. And of course, human health continues to be a major challenge. This is again of profound interest and has multifaceted dimension. One of the major issues and emerging is rising temperature. It's just not temperature, but also humidity that threatening, leading to heat stress, disproportionately affecting those who work outside, those in the cities slums, and of course the small business occupation and so on and so forth. And then of course urban heat island continues to become or emerges to become a major challenge, and as a serious health concern. Vector-borne diseases. Kathmandu, for example, has dengue epidemic right now. Everyone you talk has dengue. So therefore, these are exacerbating. And then, of course, during flood, contaminated water continues to be a problem for things like diarrheal disease, which even otherwise is a major threat. And of course, migration continues to be a major issue, particularly from the coastal areas and also from parts of hill. Of course, both pull and push factors are on operation, but then from displacement, displaced population come to cities where systems and services are already stressed. They add to the systems already on pressure, and then just creating this cycle of poverty, crucible of hazard and vulnerability. And of course, another major challenge is the challenge relates to infrastructure, which was very, very clearly evident in what happened in Nepal in this, a week old disaster. Bridges, roads, hydropower plants, dams, barrages were, faced significant damages. They were many were washed off and washed off. And then, of course, this is also the case with much of South Asia, where the infrastructure resilience, particularly, were designed based on climate patterns that were, perhaps developed in the earlier century. So these techniques, these methods that we developed and used and sort of, institutionalized over the last 100 years do not capture the erratic climate pattern that we see now. We need new metrics, new methods, new technique to address these emerging 21st century challenges. Now, having said these four sort of broad issues, so, food displacement, water and food displacement, infrastructure, and health. Let me now take this opportunity of talking about how I think we can come together to think about building resilience and adaptation. Clearly, the challenges, as was very rightly pointed out by Dr. Hamid, siloed approach don't lead us anywhere. We really need to come together in a systemic response. We need to think about multi-pronged approaches, both building resilience as well as adaptive capacity. And there are few pilots in the region, such as promoting climate resilient agriculture practices, use of drought resistance crop, improved irrigation techniques, water conservation, soil management, and of course, early flood warning system has been a sort of a very, very useful development that has happened over the last 15 years. Across the board, also in Nepal, flood warning system that we have built have saved life. The warning capacity has significantly improved. The weather warning is fairly accurate, but of course, the middle stream and downstream edge, much more needs to be done. Some of these piloted successful techniques, methods needs to be replicated and upscaled while making sure that the lessons we glean helps us avoid what I call maladaptation, that at the end of the day, we do not create the same vulnerability that created the problem in the first place. Now, clearly, expanding access to healthcare, this is again very clear after the COVID pandemic. Expanding access to healthcare services to vulnerable communities needs improving disease surveillance system, service delivery mechanism, building public awareness, and of course, building capacity of health delivery institutions. This is particularly important as we would face increasing temperature and humidity rise, as was seen in Bangladesh, in the last summer, in the Gangetic Plain, as well as plains and valleys of Nepal. The other priorities are redesigning infrastructure to withstand extreme weather events. And again, improving the early warning system that we have, particularly going on to impact-based forecasting methods. Of course, some pilots have been done in Nepal to move to the next stage. And then, of course, enhancing flood disaster preparedness by prioritizing green infrastructure, open space, parks, wetlands, spawn cities, room for rivers, as well as addressing water pollution. Again, these are not rocket science, things that we did in the past, but somehow over the last 30, 40 years, sort of, forgotten in how we have developed our cities and so on and so forth. Now, at the end, building resilience and adaptive capacity requires a systemic recourse involving improved understanding of exposure to hazard. We need to begin to figure out how the hazard scape is changing. The rainfall temperature and so on and so forth. The science and investment is needed in that sense. And there is already a regional cooperation that goes on where meteorologists of the region come together. They sort of, predict how the monsoon is going to behave, etc. So there is already a capacity that exists that needs to be taken to the next step. And of course, the next would be to conserve the natural ecosystem, because a well-preserved, conserved natural ecosystem maintains that services which people can use, and of course they can heal much better after a disruption. Then of course risk sensitive infrastructure. as I talked about, infrastructures have to be designed now differently. They need to be calibrated to withstand higher level of floods, not just floods, but also sediment, perhaps also other kind of detritus and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the users in their diversity. There are users who use the services, and of course, there are marginalized, they are uneducated, they have no opportunities, they are sort of no access to information and so on and so forth. So therefore, and then of course, there are managers who manage this system. They need resources, they need knowledge, they need information, they need technology. So therefore, capacitated knowledge, this users and managers are key. And then of course, finally, the institutions that manage these systems, the rules, the policies, the norms and practices. Again, Dr. Hamid highlighted things about flexibility. I think that remains key. So therefore, to that end, I think we in South Asia, particularly in these countries, needs to come together, create a platform. This hub is one such platform that can bring together brightest mind from the region as well as from across the globe to explore these multifaceted challenges as well as offer solutions. We talk about problems, it's important. At the same time, we also need to offer solutions and then take that iterative process in generating knowledge. And then, of course, such platforms, I'm not talking about one platform. So I think we need many, many platforms where these conversations occur simultaneously and, continuously. Facilitate sharing of knowledge, best practices, challenges, foster innovation. And then dealing with these challenges, we need to synthesize what I call natural science, social science, and indigenous practices and knowledges. We need new forms of knowledge. So therefore, this knowledge must be tailored to the context-specific solutions for the region's diverse landscape and socioeconomic condition. And the end, such a platform can focus on adaptive policy making with evidence-based insights to shape in-country plans and policies for climate resilience within the larger rubric of the regional climate context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ajaya. Sorry to rush you by the end of it, but I think those were some really, really relevant remarks that you mentioned, in particular about some of the emerging climate impacts that are only being documented and sort of added to the knowledge base as we know right now. So traditionally, again, unseasonal flooding as well as heat stresses in the South Asia region is not something that was uncommon, but I believe there was a dearth of sort of evidence, being able to have valuable evidence that would really lead to policy measures that we could make interventions out of. But that's coming to the fore at the moment. So again, taking in your point that perhaps quite a lot of the previous adaptation and resilience plans and strategies didn't adequately address this critical issue, that might be something that really needs to be addressed in the upcoming policy measures that are going through. And hopefully, as you mentioned, that we take a more transboundary look at being able to address these being able to do them just our own countries and our own nations, as these are more riparian habitats that cross boundaries. We need to be able to address these challenges from a holistic habitat sort of lens to it. And I concur with you with the fact that one summit or a virtual hub is probably not sufficient to tackle such large challenges. And I'd echo with you if there are other summits and places that we should be taking these evidences and the voices from the community. Happy to put in our collaborations on that. Thank you so much for your remarks, sir. So I'll be moving on to our next speaker. Just to keep us in with our time, Ms. Suruchi Bhadwai, who is from Terry, based in India. And Ms. Suruchi, if you could please give us a little bit of an idea about the policy measures, as we've been hearing. What are some good, effective policy measures for enhancing adaptation and resilience in South Asia? At the end of your remarks, if you could please hand over back to me. Thank you, Suruchi.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for providing me this opportunity. Of course, some of the previous speakers highlighted in detail with regards to how South Asia uniquely stands out in terms of being one of the most affected regions to disasters and extremes that we're exposed to, and therefore, the consequences of climate change that we are particularly concerned about. It is not only about the physical impacts that are likely to be observed over the region, but the ripple off effects that we see on the social side and the economic side with regards to the impacts, which are less well understood, is basically what we're concerned about. Of course, over time, over the last 20-24 years, one of the things that we have observed, there has been a concern with regards to how the climate is changing. There is unfolding or likely to unfold, and therefore there are policies and plans that have been put in place by most of the countries in the region to be able to address these challenges. There has been focus of multilaterals and bilaterals with regards to the development of various programs which are targeted towards addressing some of these risks. However, there are disparities that remain. We do have some countries who have the national adaptation plans in place, but not all countries have them ready as of date, if I were to just summarize. And therefore, there's a long way to go with regards to action and implementation. In many cases, while we basically understand what are the nature of risks that we face within countries, and therefore basis which plans and policies have been formulated, I think in terms of implementation, we are still a long way to go. To answer the question with regards to adaptation adequacy and adaptation effectiveness, I think we do not have enough information with regards to how do we define adequacy, because we do not understand the risks in a particular location, in a holistic way, and therefore we do not know what is the extent to which we reduce the risk in a particular location. As long as we do not go down to those levels of understanding that we need to understand what the risks mean at the local level, I think it's not going to resolve the issue with regards to formulating these strategies and keep talking about them, that whether we have these plans and policies in place, because at the end of the day, all that is needed, or we basically want to see, is the implementation that happens on the ground, and the reduction of the risks that basically we want to see with regards to the changes in the climate that we are basically talking about. And that will not happen until we basically understand how these different strategies within the plans or the policies that have basically been formulated will roll out in terms of a roadmap for implementation. What are the challenges in the implementation process of each strategy that we are talking about, and how do we address those challenges when we are to take it forward for implementation? Where are the capacity gaps that exist, and how do we fill those capacity gaps? I think that is where the challenges in the region now lie. With regards to our understanding and what we need to do in what sector, and cross-sectoral approaches and integrated approaches, I think there's a lot of documentation out there in each country now with regards to how we would like to look at the issue, what are the different solutions that exist, etc., whether cross-sectoral or within a sector, etc. How do we go about doing it? And are we able to deliver if we've already identified these actions and interventions to take them forward? I think that is where we have a less hold on with regards to our understanding who all matter in the entire implementation process. And then, of course, having a very robust monitoring and evaluation process around it to see what progress is being made with regards to the implementation of those actions that we are interested in. And therefore, I do feel while we have made progress with regards to the outlining of what we may be interested in doing and implementing and addressing the risks, that are likely, I think in terms of implementation, we still, regionally speaking, and in every country out in the region, basically we have a long way to go. And I think the need of the hour is to work along with different stakeholders, that matter within a sector or within a cross-sectoral approach that we are trying to address the risk reduction, to be able to have, a successful implementation model in place that we can talk about with regards to adaptation. And I would just leave my points there.
Saqib, we don't hear you.
Saqib, no, you.
I'm so sorry. I think I was on mute. Thank you, Suruchiji. So sorry, I was on mute for that. I just wanted to commend you for the remarks that you made on the policy measures, in particular for the points that you made about defining adequacy. I think that again in the international forum has been a question that they've been struggling with. What are really the adequate level of policy initiatives that we need to be designing and implementing, but also in terms of understanding whether adaptation is actually being implemented with benefits. Are we actually being able to understand whether adaptation is being impactful in the communities, and do we have that sort of long-term data trend to be able to say that adaptation is being successful, or are we really doing it in a projectized manner and only being able to look at efficacy and prosperity in a project phase, which might not necessarily mean that adaptation is being achieved, but in a small lens, it's being a little bit successful in those areas. So again, thank you so much for your remarks. And again, for all our summit audience, if you would like to get in touch, please do feel free to write in the chat. We'll try and address as many of the questions live as possible, but also offline after the session ends. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Ghulam Rabbani, who will talk a little bit about decentralizing and localizing adaptation efforts and some of their experiences from here in Bangladesh. Rabbani Bhai, the floor is yours. If you could hand back to me at the end of your remarks, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Saqib, and your team, ICAD, for organizing such an interesting event at this regional level. Let me just share my experience. Focusing on three main points. The first one is some of the success stories, and the second one is some of the lessons that we have learned over the years, and the third one is how we can really decentralize and localize this exercise. But first of all, this is a bit different if you compare to adaptation projects or policy initiatives or strategic intervention. This is a finance mechanism that I'll be talking about. It's a climate bridge fund established by BRAC, with support from the government of Germany through KfW. So in terms of success stories, in many cases I used to state that climate bridge fund mechanism itself is a success story. I tell you why. Because every time we discuss and debate that we need predictable finance, sustainable finance to make sure that we can really support long-term adaptation effort. But if you look at the CBF mechanism, the amount of resources that we started in 2019, we still have the same amount of resources in the bank. Then what did you do in last 5 years? We reached about 100,000 people, more than 70% women in 5 urban locations in city corporation and Paurasabhas in Bangladesh. So these are all bonus. Then how did it happen? Because we invested the principal amount that remained untouched, and we used the income to support small-scale adaptation projects. And so it shows the sustainability of the financing mechanism. So this is an innovative mechanism. Now the question is, what did you learn from it? Our analysis shows that the efficacy of this model is directly proportional to the gamut of the portfolio. I tell you how. If you add 10 million more with the existing 10 million, our operational cost goes down from 20% to 17%. If you add 20 million euros on top of this 10 million, our operational cost goes down to 11% from 20%. So you see, it's a directly proportional with this model. So absolutely successful model. So that's one thing. Now let me talk about some of the field level success stories. I will give 1 or 2 examples. The first example that I want to talk about is a solar powered submersible pump that we implemented in 2 urban locations, Khulna City Corporation areas, in some of the slums, and also in Rajshahi City Corporation areas. What we did, in most of the places in this country, many NGOs and many stakeholders implemented this submersible pump with support from the diesel power, which means the diesel operated submersible pump. But instead of using diesel, we are using solar systems. So that actually reduces the greenhouse gas emission, and we use mitigation co-benefit while we implement an adaptation action. So this is how we actually, benefit, more than 1,000 households in Greenland abortion in Khulna, for example. So that's a success story that you see. And interestingly, I just want to refer that, senior officials, including mayor of Khulna City Corporation, visited this solar powered submersible pump, and he mentioned that from now on, we are going to suggest all NGOs who want to work in Khulna City Corporation area has to follow this model. This solar powered system, has to follow this model. So you understand, how it is getting a successful, flavor from this. And one more example that I would like to mention is about the livelihood, because every area, urban location you go, there are two major problems, two common problems that we see from all proposal, all concept ideas. The first one is livelihoods, and second one is the wash. So in terms of livelihood, supporting livelihood, BRAC has an excellent livelihood model being implemented by ultra poor graduation program. They call it UPG model. These are being scaled up in 50 countries by the governments and non-government organization. Interestingly, they follow 2 years, with this model. They identify the women most vulnerable and ultra poor women, and they bring them under a 2 years process. So what they do at the beginning, they identify these people, climate vulnerable and more ultra poor women, and they develop a plan of action for 2 years. In first 18 months, they develop their plan, and they explore their interest in which areas they want to build their capacity and want to start an enterprise, small enterprises or business, whatever they want to do. So, and then they provide the asset support or cash support, and they monitor, and then they provide the financial literacy training. So in 18 months, they provide training, they provide cash, they monitor their system, they monitor their benefits. In 24 months, they are, they become adapted from a vulnerable condition to a capable condition. So that's how livelihood, model is being, really successful in not only Bangladesh, and as far as information that we get, from all 50 countries. So this is how I can share the success stories. Do I have a few more minutes?
Just very briefly, 30 seconds.
Okay. So in terms of learning, as I mentioned about the co-benefits, that is one of the learnings. Normally in Bangladesh, people do not really, go explore, a different type of co-benefits option from an adaptation intervention. So another example that we want to share is, urban settings and rural settings are completely different. In rural settings, the household has a small home, small pond ecosystem, but when they come to urban areas, they have almost nothing. They need almost everything. They need house, they need wash, they need livelihood, they need even the walkways to go around. So inter-sectoral approach or integrated approach is extremely important in designing adaptation actions. I will finish with just one example of how we can decentralize. There are 3 small points. The first thing is we need to have a decision. We need to have a critical decision to decentralize the finance, climate finance, at the sub-district level, so that they can plan and they can, prepare their budget. They can implement the adaptation actions at the sub-district level. Otherwise, they depend on the central system and they fail to do this, to effective adaptation. I'm so sorry for taking more time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robani Bhai. I think those are some really excellent initiatives that you also mentioned, but also ending with the final point that you mentioned about localizing the funding. I think some of the major challenges that we've been looking at, in particularly on locally led adaptation and resilience issues, and soon to be addressing loss and damage issues, will be how to get the funding down flexibly, down to the ground, down to communities and subnational entities. And I think some of the examples that you highlighted can be some really good evidences of what kind of different funding instruments and mechanisms and channels, we really should be exploring from the global stages, and how can we implement them in national and regional areas. So thank you so much for highlighting those examples. I'd like to now hand over for a little bit of a summation. I'm so sorry, Dr. Vimal, that it might be a very difficult task for you, so I don't envy the role that you have. But thank you so much for taking the role and maybe just getting us to sort of think a little bit more holistically about today's session. And then what are some of the new things that all of us can really look forward and spur this collaboration going forward. And with that, I think we'll almost be at the end of our session, so we'll probably have to head off. But I'd like to hand over for Dr. Vimal's remarks, please. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Akib, and let me thank all the speakers. Very good insights. I think I will not do justice to summarize, many things that you have highlighted, very important things. But I think the importance of the resilience hub that ICAD and the team is, putting forward. I think we need several of these discussions to come forward so that we can share knowledge, experiences, the commonalities, and some of the challenges that we face. I think it's very, very important to share. So just to sum up our distinguished guests' remarks. So we know that the issues is very complex, it's very wicked in terms of how climate impacts are unfolding in our region. The scale of impact is very, very high, multifaceted in nature, massive loss and damage evidences that we see. So I think we have to see more differently in terms of how we view issues. Also, these issues are transboundary in nature, so we share common issues, and it is very, very important that we need to come together in terms of having debate, discussion around this. And I also like what Surichi said. It is not only physical impact that we commonly discuss on climate change, the ripple effect, the economic, socio-structural issues which are less understood has to be more, shared, more documented in terms of, finding innovative solutions on how to deal with. We know there are policies and plans, there are some progress made, but there are disparities in terms of responding to action, mostly, implemented action that can create impacts. And more around, how do we really understand risks and vulnerability? What are some of the learnings? How should we take this, learning into more elevate this understanding so that we can design more contextual things? So coming to solutions, there are very good examples that we can learn from South Asia. And I think this has to be more shared, more documented, and we need to come together so that it can lead to more systemic thinking, collectiveness, a more integrated and intersectional approach. They're good practices, lesson that are very, very important for us to internalize. We talk about LLA principles, and it's very important how these critical decisions that are taken helps in decentralization, institutional empowerment, addressing socio-structural equality, and empowering local institutions so that access to fund and technology happens in just a manner. There are many designs, practices that are working when they are tailor-made, contextual, more flexible in nature, and targeted. And we have seen examples from Nepal, from the region, from BRAC on climate risk fund, which provides more predictable and sustainable finance. I think we should build on that in terms of improving access and delivery of climate finance, where the world is all struggling in terms of decentralizing finance. And I think we can improve access, incentivize, create incentive mechanisms, and adopt more targeted approach so that can generate more, replicative effect. So as a way forward, I think we need to come together and address this complex and wicked problem collectively. And this is one of the platform that provides that. So I think as a practitioner, as a policymaker, researchers, we should have a regular interaction within South Asian countries because of our shared, understanding that will help each other. It is very important to understand adaptation adequacy, as Suruchi said, just to really fill the gaps. And we need to design more successful adaptation models through our experiences so that we can implement that are more practical and that are more localized. And I think conversation synthesis and generating new knowledge should be continued, because what we lack is basically focusing on research, evidence generation, and sharing. Finally, I think these learnings are together very, very important a way forward for South Asian countries to come together for us researchers and practitioners, so that we can at least address this, transboundary regional common problem that we are facing. So thank you, Resilience Hub and ICAD and Shakib, for your wonderful facilitation, and to all the distinguished, speakers. I think your valuable knowledge is highly regarded. Thank you.